Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for an engaging webinar presentation, New Tool on Crisis Response and Postvention Protocol After a Death in the School. My name is Maria Noesi, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules. The presentation today will be recorded, so a copy of the presentation will be sent to you after the webinar with the slides and the audio recording. So don't worry about having to take notes. Attendees are in listen-only mode, so we won't be able to listen to you. However, you are more than welcome to submit questions via the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We have left time at the end to answer all of your questions, so please participate throughout. And finally, if you're on social media, please connect with us at Cognito on Twitter, and you can also ask questions or participate using the Cognito Webinars hashtag. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to just take a quick poll to see where everybody is in terms of this topic. So for all of you on the call, if you don't mind telling us, does your school district currently have a response plan for when a death occurs? Let us know. We'll give everybody a couple of minutes to respond and see. All right, let's see what the response say. According to all of the participants, 58% said yes, which is great. 15% said no, and 27% said not sure. So hopefully after this presentation and after we introduce this new tool, those of you that are not sure will have a better clarity and can find out where your school district currently stands. So with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about our presenters today. We are joined by renowned experts from the field who will provide insights on why it is critical for schools to have an effective response plan in place. They're going to discuss some of the current gaps that exist and also share insights on the collaboration with Cognito to create the new simulation, Resilient Together, Coping with Loss at School. Finally, you'll also have an exclusive first look of the simulation. I'd like to first introduce Richard Lieberman, who is a lecturer in the Graduate School of Education at Loyola Marymount University. And from 1986 to 2011, he coordinated suicide prevention services for Los Angeles Unified School District, the second largest school district in the U.S. He has co-authored numerous books, chapters on suicide intervention in the schools, consulted nationally with districts experiencing suicide clusters, served on the steering committee for the Suicide Prevention Research Center, and contributed to both the SAMHSA Preventing Suicide and SBRC AFSB After a Suicide School Toolkit. We are also joined by Dr. Scott Poland, who is a professor at the College of Psychology and the co-director of the Suicide and Violence Prevention Office at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale. He is an internationally recognized expert on school safety, youth suicide, self-injury, bullying, school crisis prevention intervention, threat assessment, and parenting in challenging times. He has also authored or co-authored 5 books and many chapters and articles on these subjects. His 5th book, entitled Suicide in Schools, was published in 2015, and he also recently authored the Suicide Safer School Plan for the state of Texas and the Crisis Action School Toolkit, Suicide for the state of Montana. Last but not least, we're definitely joined by Jennifer Spiegler, who is a Senior Vice President for Strategic Partnerships at Cognito. Her background spans from education, business, and not-for-profit sectors in areas such as instructional design, strategic communications, fundraising, and art administration. At Cognito, she leads a team on strategic partnerships across our government, state-level agencies, nonprofits, and school districts, overseeing a multidisciplinary team to support client marketing, customer experience, and simulation customization. So to say the least, we are joined by a full roster of experts who will provide with us an engaging presentation. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Rich and Dr. Scott Poland.
Hello, this is Scott, and I want to thank every single one of you for tuning in today. Most of all, we hope we'll say some things meaningful and helpful to every single one of you. I worked full-time in the schools for 26 years, but that very first year, I'm really sorry to tell you that a student was killed in an accident, and he attended the school where I was assigned. I'm a little embarrassed to say that as their school psychologist, nobody asked me to get involved. I'm not sure that the middle school actually did anything at all, but not too long after his death, they put up one of those roadway markers. And I went by that marker every single day on the way to work. And it was a constant reminder to me of how important it is to plan, get involved, and really responding to a tragedy in a school takes an entire team. And we'll be talking today about the critical role of administrators, teachers, support personnel. So again, thank you for tuning in. We hope to say some things that will be helpful to you. As we get up the very first slide, Maria, we want to talk about a little more elaboration on why this is so important. There's some pretty sad data out there about the percentage of students that lose a peer at some point during their school career, the percentage that lose a parent. Sadly, many, many young people are exposed to trauma and loss. And perhaps the most difficult losses are those that are shocking and surprising. When somebody is killed in an accident, when somebody is a murder victim, when somebody dies by suicide, those are extremely difficult to deal with. Now, probably almost everybody listening has lost a loved one to cancer. And when they were diagnosed and when the treatment wasn't really helping, hopefully you had plenty of time to get used to the idea you were going to lose your loved one. But when it's an accident, a homicide, or a suicide, nobody was expecting that. And I'm a really big believer in we must tell kids the truth in developmentally appropriate language. And I remember going into one classroom, the teacher of the fourth grade class had just died from cancer, and the students were like, they lied to us. They were here yesterday telling us that our teacher was going to get better. And I think we need to be honest and let kids know when somebody is not responding to treatment. Please keep them in your thoughts and prayers, but not everybody recovers from cancer. I also would have to say that I made a mistake early in my career because they always wanted me to talk to a classroom of students. And too often it was me standing at the front. They're all in their desks, they're in rows, they can't even see each other. And what I learned to do was basically sit down with the students. And the less I talk, the more they talk, the better. And let's arrange all the desks or chairs so everyone can see each other. And there's no absolute right or wrong way to respond to a tragic death in the school. It's really simply about being compassionate, giving everybody permission for their own emotions. I've always found the younger the students, the more we're talking about artwork, markers. Let's make something that we can share with his or her family. And the older students, they want to talk a lot more, but they want to get involved and they want to make a difference. In fact, we see an example of that this last year involving Stoneman Douglas in terms of those students and their Never Again movement. And I actually live only about an hour away from Stoneman Douglas, and next week I will be the speaker at a community event in Parkland about suicide prevention. And we'll be talking today about some of the unique things that are important to keep in mind when the death was the result of a suicide. And perhaps the most basic thing I can say is we really need to help the faculty first. And that means have a staff meeting as quickly as possible, use a calling tree, get information out. My wife is a retired principal. She would make an announcement if it was during the school day. Teachers, please check your email as quickly as possible. There would be the facts, there would be the script, ideas for what teachers can do to support students. And let's move on to the very next slide. Maria, thanks. So now we're looking at, there are key questions, and you've already been asked one of those, and thankfully most of you do have a plan in place. And the plan needs to be something that is continually reviewed. And in all honesty, I believe educators today need training about responding to tragedies and a death that affects a school. And we need handouts, training, reminders, so that everybody understands their critical role. And by the way, the most typical response that a student has to a tragedy is they regress academically, they regress behaviorally, they have nightmares, sleeping problems, and worries about the future. Those are not unusual reactions. Those are the typical reactions. And we need all the adults in their lives, the teachers, the parents, to respond with patience, structure, tolerance, and most of all, love. Sometimes I hear school staff say, we were told never to put an arm around a kid. Really? His best friend was killed and somebody's telling you you can't put an arm around them? And Rich and I both learned a lot from some Israeli psychologists, and I want to quickly sketch out what they called their circles of vulnerability model. And if you think of 3 circles, geographic proximity, psychosocial proximity, and trauma history. So let me give you a simple example. Bill was riding in a car with his best friend Tom. Tom was killed. Bill survived. So now I just gave you the geographic proximity. I gave you the psychosocial proximity. But what if I tell you Bill's mom is dying of cancer right now? It's the intersection. Think of this as like a psychological triage. And having responded to countless school tragedies, and the district where I was the go-to guy after every crisis had more than 100,000 students. Not as large as LAUSD, but they wanted me at the school virtually every time after a death. And the bottom line is most of our interventions in schools are too short in duration, and they focus on too few students. Then there's what's called the 60-20-20 rule, meaning that 60% of us, no matter how staggering the tragedy, we are going to be okay. Our family, our faith, our support system. 20% we would expect to have minor problems, but sadly, 20% will have major problems and need ongoing support, not only at school, but in the community. And sadly, there's often an anniversary effect to the problem of suicide. Communication is critical. What if we're not sure what exactly happened? We just know somebody died. Well, my advice would be get your best support person, get in the car with the principal, drive to the home, and actually talk to the family. And I would always meet surviving siblings. And the sooner we reach out to them, the better they are going to do. So having this plan to make absolutely sure we know what happened and then tell everyone the truth. And social media has such a potential to be positive if messages were going out about hope, about resiliency, about where the resources are to get help for you or for your friend. So the next slide is talking about like what are the gaps? And as we talk about that for a moment, I'd really like to stress key roles for certain personnel and basically administrators. The administrator really sets the tone for responding to the crisis. And I believe it's very important that the administrator get input from their staff. I actually believe the wisest decisions in education, those are made by a team of people. So let's make wise decisions Let's share information with everybody. Let's implement our plan. And you know, everybody listening today, without a doubt, has had to respond to a death of a staff member or student at your school. And I don't want to make anybody feel bad, but I always like to ask a simple question. What worked? What didn't work so well? What could you do differently next time? As well as, is there anything we could do to prevent further deaths of staff or students? So the administrator is a really critical person. This is not a day to be gone to a meeting. This is a day to support the staff, set the tone. Hopefully they're not afraid to show some of their own emotions, and they need to be visible and available for all staff and students. And they need to recognize the long-term impact. Now, support personnel, and when I say that, I'm talking about counselors, school psychologists, and social workers. Support personnel, it is really important that they are involved in planning with the administration. I could give you several examples where the administrator, their first idea about what to do wasn't exactly the best. But once they started down that course, it was very difficult to redirect some of the planning. So the support personnel, they would be key to getting involved in helping the faculty first. Sadly, I had a lot of experience talking to school staff before the bell rings about the tragedy. And one of those examples comes immediately to mind because I happen to be in Houston today. Very sorry to tell you that it was murder-suicide. Dad killed the entire family. Then he died by suicide. 3 precious little girls, 5, 7, and 10, were all killed. Now, everybody's at the faculty meeting. Everybody's very sad. And the principal says, this is probably going to be the worst day you've ever spent in education in your life. I mean, I know it's a really sad day, but that's not how you're going to get the best out of somebody. So as soon as I got a chance to talk, I talked about we're going to help each other and we're going to help the students. And by pulling together, using all the strength and resiliency in this room, we are going to make this day go better than you ever thought it possibly could. And hopefully, support personnel are very aware of students that have already been affected by traumatic events. Hopefully, they would be using that circles of vulnerability model and reaching out to siblings, reaching out to family, those in-person contacts. And it's also very important that in our classrooms, not only do we need to give kids permission for any and all emotions, we need to talk to them a little bit about the rituals that are around visitation, the rituals that are around funerals. And having gone to lots of funerals for students who died, sometimes it can be really frustrating. You're looking around, you're the psychologist or the counselor or the principal, and it's like, there's hundreds of kids here. Where are their parents? Parents need to be involved and support their children through this entire process. If their best friend had died or if their favorite teacher has died. And teachers are in a key position to basically let everybody know the facts and give all students permission for a range of emotions and provide activities to basically express those emotions through artwork, projects, ceremonies, rituals. So the most common thing that I've found that kids want to do after a death, they just want to be allowed to talk about the person. They want to reminisce about the things they really enjoyed about that person. And I remember with one group I led, a very popular teacher named Joe had died, and they just wanted to talk about what a wonderful person he was. And then I asked a pretty obvious question. Well, have any of you had a loss in your own family. One kid, Billy, yes, my dad was killed in a truck accident. Well, you see, I know that I'm calling the parents of every single kid in my group, but I'm going to be spending the most time with Billy's mom, talking about the loss in his actual family. And we want teachers and all staff and all parents to truly be there to listen to students after a tragedy. One of my favorite phrases is reach out, don't preach. And then the 5 T's for the teachers: talk, touch, tears, time, and take care of oneself. I imagine many people listening today are the caregivers. And I want to say something to you, and I want to give you permission for being able to say sometime, I need to sit this one out. I'm not going to be able to agree with the grieving staff or students this morning. Let me run off the handout. Let me continue with the normal scheduling, because some things have happened in my personal life. At this moment, I'm not really in the best position to help others. So it's absolutely essential that we learn to take care of ourselves. And hopefully, as caregivers, you have significant others involved in your life who will truly listen to you. Going back to schools and communities where I've responded to tragedies, as Rich has also, sometimes the people who lost their best friend or their own child say something like this. Even the people closest to me say that I should be over this by now. They're tired of hearing me talk about this. Instead, we should be saying, I am always here for you. Grief and moving through the process is very individualized, and hopefully everybody is surrounded by loving and caring family and friends. Hopefully they're optimistic about the future. They have a strong self-concept, and they use those problem-solving skills. Now I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Rich.
Thanks, Scott. And thank you, Jennifer and Maria and Cognito, for the opportunity to be part of this project. Let's go on to the other slide. Hello, Maria. There you go. Like Scott, I'm pretty much dedicated my school site career to crisis response in the schools. And it can be intense and challenging. The message about self-care can't be understated. Every time a principal, a teacher, mental health professional connects with a student, they kind of donate a little piece of their heart. And while you hope it will protect that child, for you, you have donated that piece. So a teacher can start out in September with 4 good chambers in their heart, but by June, you have donated away your left ventricle. So the message in Resilient Together values taking care of yourself so that you can best take care of your students. Resilient Together also values crisis prevention and response, because the manner of how schools respond to a tragedy can set the tone for healing and recovery. So let's take a look at some other ways that Resilient Together can help. Scott and I have worked with many courageous administrators who have shown incredible leadership when responding to tragic events that impact their schools. They have to make many decisions, write many communications under a lot of pressure. As Scott said, these are sudden and tragic and sometimes violent losses, which really ratchets up the impact. So Resilient Together can empower administrators with knowledge on how to proceed after a loss and help administrators utilize safe messaging in communications to students, to parents, to staff, that may limit contagion that can follow such tragic losses, particularly after a suicide. It's important to carry messages that suicide is preventable. Everyone plays a role in suicide prevention. And there are evidence-based treatments for all the risk factors. And it's important to understand that kids are resilient and can get better. And an important message in Resilient Together, and that Scott and I take, talking about difficult topics will not make them happen. Talking about suicide will not cause an individual to think about suicide. It actually, all the research says, it lessens their anxiety. There are two key roles that Resilient Together empowers staff with knowledge and skill to start these difficult conversations. And two of the roles is, as Scott said, to help kids understand that there's a wide array of crisis reactions, and they are common. Many times kids just want to know that they're not going crazy, that these thoughts are torturing them and need to be expressed. And another critical role of teachers is to identify kids in need of support and referral, as Scott said, utilizing, it's a form of psychological triage. Teachers know their kids the best. I managed a hotline for 25 years for LAUSD, and I took over 22,000 calls. 1 out of 2 of those calls came from elementary schools on how to proceed with students who are at risk. And I would talk to many teachers on the phone, and when a teacher would say to me over the hotline that this behavior is not like this kid, well, that just jumps out at a hotline operator. And it's valuable information. So teachers can be very critical members of crisis teams, and for every student they refer as potentially at risk for suicide, we encourage them to join the crisis team because they know the child the best. How a staff responds in the aftermath of a tragedy can have impact on potential traumatization of students, especially at the elementary level. And as Scott was saying, staff can be impacted by loss. And at times, as both Scott and I have done when we have been dealing with loss in our personal lives, to say professionally, I'm going to sit this one out. We always recommend to administrators when a tragedy occurs to triage your staff first. A death of a student immediately in a high school impacts 6 teachers. And we believe that kind of information should not be delivered to teachers in a letter in their mailbox or an email box. We can't underscore that connectedness in delivering such difficult information, because a death, and a death by suicide, can be a traumatic loss for some. So we would also recommend having substitutes at the school to allow staff, mental health staff too, if they have worked. And we have worked with many clinician survivors. Many times these troubled kids are not a mystery to school site crisis teams. That teams have worked together to attempt to intervene with children, and yet the worst goes on to happen. So we would never ask a staff member who has been so impacted by grief to perform any duties during the intervention. And in general, I will tell you that many school staff are very uncomfortable with the mental health role, and that is totally okay. And if they want assistance talking to their kids, we encourage them to collaborate with their crisis team and with their mental health staff in order to intervene with students that they are concerned about. Just overall, if you want your staff to learn how to start these difficult kinds of conversations so they can better connect with their students and colleagues, then I think Resilient Together can help you achieve those goals. I'm going to turn it back to so that we can see more about it to Jennifer.
Thank you very much. I will hand it over to Jennifer Spiegler for the next section of the webinar.
Okay. Thank you, Scott and Rich. That's great information for everybody on this call. We know this is such an important topic. Just for those of you on the call, you're among over 1,000 people who opted in to join us today. So we understand that this is a difficult topic and a fraught topic and something a lot of people want to learn more about. And they want to learn about it from Scott Pollan and Rich Lieberman, who crisscross the country advising school districts on how to address a loss in the school, how to build resiliency in the face of a loss. And our goal at Cognito is to distill the knowledge and expertise of experts like Scott and Rich, and in fact, the expertise of Scott and Rich in this case, and bring it to you and the schools and school staff that you work with so that we can help everyone prepare in advance to address a crisis in their community. So we're very excited today to launch this Resilient Together simulation. For those of you who aren't familiar with things that we have built in the past, Cognito is a health simulation company. We do a lot of our work with K-12 professional development and have trained over 500,000 teachers in how to identify, approach, and refer students in distress. So today, Resilient Together is an extension of that work, which includes trauma and bullying and mental health and suicide prevention, because we know that whether your school has experienced a loss recently and you need quick, just-in-time solution for training your staff, or you're really trying to build that plan and get ahead of the curve, like the 57% of people on this call who said they have a plan, we want to be there to help you, and we want to bring you, as I mentioned, that, years of expertise from Scott and Rich, and put it at the fingertips of your school staff. So let's take a look at this online training experience. It's a role-play simulation, and we will flip over to the actual live simulation with help from the wizards at Cognito. Okay. We called this simulation Resilient Together. We did not call it Postvention. We did not call it talking about death. We, as was it Scott or Rich? This is going to be the best experience that we can possibly make it. No. For your staff. So I want to call attention to the course menu. The first thing you're going to do, and if you're familiar with Cognito simulations, this one is a little bit different. Before you go into the simulation, you're going to choose a role. You're going to choose whether you're an administrator or a teacher or staff person. You're going to choose the level that you work at, either elementary school or secondary school. Why? Because the simulation is going to dynamically reorganize the content to address what we think is the most important thing for you as an individual to know. So this really came out of a conversation with Scott and Rich about their concerns, especially for administrators, in setting the tone, putting the planning in place, and being willing in the face of a tragedy to face it rather than plunging at their head in the sand and hoping it will go away. It doesn't go away, and we're all very, very passionate about getting people to acknowledge that and take the steps to do the best possible planning that we can. So what you're looking at here is the teacher and staff view. I entered the simulation here as a teacher in a secondary school, and I want to just show a little bit of the course menu. Your first module, and you can see the whole experience takes maybe 40 minutes to complete. You have a short introduction, learn about crisis response planning. Then you have an interactive module where you learn about supporting your students, and then you in the face of a suicide. And the elementary module, because suicide is still thankfully quite a rare event in an elementary school, the elementary module will address primarily the death, an accidental death, a death by drowning in the community. But in the secondary school, we do address the scenario of a death by suicide. And as Rich reinforced, there's a lot of self-care that is needed. And so we included a self-care conversation. Ms. Park is one of the teachers that you will meet. And, she gets advice and support from a colleague teacher about her own reaction, her own grief in the face of this death by suicide. And then Module 4 is about implementing a plan and really what that planning process for the crisis response team should look like and can look like, and models the multidisciplinary team approach. So if you haven't seen the Cognito simulations, this is what the conversation looks like. Here we're entering the conversation at the beginning between Ms. Park and Amy. Amy's classmate has died by suicide. So we are using instructional design best practices, and you'll notice several things about this scenario. Ms. Park is sitting at eye level with Amy. The door is open behind her, and she's set aside time to have a private conversation with Amy. Okay, let's start.
Difficult couple of weeks. I just wanted to check in and see how you're holding up.
Life goes on, right?
Okay. I'm so sorry. Apparently I put myself on mute. I don't know when I did that, probably when she was talking. So Amy is responding to Ms. Park's question, and Jackie comes up with some advice. You discussed Amy's academic performance before asking how she was doing, making Amy feel like she was in trouble. Saying you were worried also carried judgment. If there's something you're concerned about, it's better to make specific factual observations about her behavior. Okay, so, you know, we don't always do everything right in life, and fortunately, there are do-overs. So let's see what it would have been like to undo our last choice and try something different. And this time you might be able to hear what Amy says. So there was a second choice. I noticed you moved your desk away. Let's try that.
Well, I noticed today you moved your desk away from the rest of the class.
Did I? Huh. I guess I just wanted some space.
Sure. I also noticed you didn't participate in your group work on Monday.
I'm just not thinking about school stuff right now, Miss Park. I'll do better. I'm sorry.
Okay, so now you have another feature to pay attention to. Jackie says, good job. You made a factual, non-judgmental observation about Amy's behavior. And she opened up a little. And as you look down, you'll see your meter is giving you some additional feedback. And you have increased her comfort with this conversation, which is really the goal here. So let's make one more turn, and then we'll go back. Let's see. So now you can see your choices have changed. Now you can continue to pursue this conversation. You can get information. You can give advice. You can set some expectations, buckle down and get back to normal. And you can support her. If you're struggling with things, you should talk to me about it, or you haven't done anything wrong. So let's try getting some more information out of Amy.
What kinds of things have you been thinking about?
I've been thinking about Eric and how, like if we'd been better friends, maybe I could have helped him.
And she has a little more comfort because she's able to disclose what she's really thinking about. And Jackie says open-ended questions, and open-ended questions are a target technique here. Like what kinds of things give students space to answer however they want. They tell students that you're listening to them. And that's really important. Within all of these conversation techniques, we're really drawing from the techniques of motivational interviewing, which is a set of techniques for that was originally developed for talking with patients with addiction issues, but is being recognized more and more in education as a way of talking with students to motivate behavior change. So I'm going to stop here. Everybody on this call is going to get a link to the demo of this conversation or of this simulation, and you'll be able to try it yourself, which is really the most important thing. So as I mentioned, there are 3 conversations that you would be exposed to you'd be exposed as a learner to 2 of these conversations. If you choose to play at the elementary school level, you're going to have a conversation with Aiden, an elementary school student who's, as I mentioned, whose classmate has drowned while on a family vacation. If you choose to play at the secondary level, you're going to have a conversation with Amy. And regardless of which level you choose to play at, you're going to have the opportunity to take on the role of a peer and talk with Ms. Park, who really needs to take care of herself. In addition to the simulation itself, simulation is really packaged with a lot of other tools to support your implementation of the simulation, but also integrating your response in how to really go about response planning. There is in addition to a printable summary of the course with all of the learning points that are coming up, you have an implementation guide that includes a crisis response and postvention checklist. And it's sort of like a quick guide to crisis response planning that's only 5 pages long, as opposed to many of the toolkits out there that are very long and involved. But this is sort of the quick start guide. And it also links you to 2 toolkits that have been made available through SAMHSA and the SPRC. SAMHSA's Preventing Suicide, a toolkit for high schools, and After a Suicide, a toolkit for schools, developed by SPRC, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So we want to make sure that you're really using these tools to support your planning process, improve your planning process. If you're in the 57% of schools that has a process for dealing with the death in your school, when's the last time that process was reviewed? And when is the last time that process was communicated to all staff? If you're in the 15% that are unsure, this is an opportunity to say, what is our plan, and is it as good as it can be? And for those of you who don't have a plan, you can start really from the ground up building something that's great. Let's go to, I think we're ready for Q&A, actually. So we saw some questions coming in. The first question I want to direct to Scott. Somebody wants to know, have you repeat the 5 T's, please?
Oh, sure. They were talk, touch, tears, time, and take care of oneself. One other thing I'd like to quickly mention is that our best advice to everybody listening is to develop a memorialization plan. Decide what you will do when a student or a staff member dies by suicide or any cause of death, and do the same thing every time, regardless of socioeconomic popularity or cause of death.
Great. Thank you, Scott. The next question is for Rich. It looks like a former LMU grad is on the call, and they say hello, and they hope that you're doing well. So their question is, as a first-year school psychologist working at a set of 3 charter schools, they're having a hard time establishing themselves as a resource or leader when it comes to responding to individuals or school-wide crises, other than when it's regarding to a student with a disability. So what are some initial steps that they can take to help earn the trust of their administrators and supervisors?
Did you ask what statistics to take in?
No.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part of that question.
Yeah, so the question is, for this particular person, how can they, or, as a first-year school psychologist just starting out, how can they establish themselves as a trusted resource within the school district with their administrators and supervisor? It looks like they're only turning to them as a resource when it has something to do with a student with a disability.
Well, the first thing I would say, and because this is an LMU grad, she took a course specifically on responding to crises in the schools because of the value of the program. This is something that's not unusual for mental health personnel, because at times their services are kind of limited in the minds of certain administrators. But school psychologists, school counselors, school social workers, school nurses are incredibly valuable members of teams. So the first thing I would say is, if you have a team at your school, I hope that you are on that team and that you encourage that team to meet in prevention mode. And when you do meet in prevention mode, um, subtly you can pick just a few critical points, like the point Scott said of, I think we need to develop a memorial process because we have had some difficulty when we have established precedents of planting a tree when a student died. But now it's inappropriate to plant a tree for a student who has died by suicide. So if we have a memorial process, it is to the best. And I would also take materials such as Cognito, such as the toolkit, after a suicide toolkit, to your administrators in prevention mode to encourage them to take some time for preparedness so that when tragedy strikes, they can be better prepared.
Maria, I had just one thing to add. It's a bit of a process. It takes some time to build up the credibility and to really become the go-to person, and have the administrator really seek you out. And I hope the person realizes it's a process. They'll get there and they'll be able to impact the whole system.
I would add really quickly that I think a great thing you could do as a young or a recently minted school psychologist would be even to offer a suicide prevention presentation to the school community and start that conversation in a public forum, and then open the door to what kind of planning could be done. I think Maria wants me to address a question that came up, which is about implementation. Oh, when is the right time to implement the simulation in a school? Is that right? Yeah. So I would say, and it is probably a better question for Rich and Scott, I would say that it would be ideal to have your crisis response plan in place and then to follow up with training. But if you are in a situation where you have no crisis response plan and your school has weathered a suicide or a death, anything is better than nothing. And I think this would be a very solid way to start the process of addressing what's happening in your school. Would you agree with that, Scott and Rich?
Well, I would add that sadly, I think all schools have dealt with a tragedy. So having that conversation, how could we improve? What could we do better? And now let's look at Cognito simulation as we try to be better prepared, as unfortunately we'll probably have another death at some point.
Great. Maria, what's our next question?
Great. This is a more specific question. For a more of an online learning environment, what are some suggestions that you can give for intervention response for an environment where it's online learning versus traditional?
Well, this is actually an incredibly challenging task. I'll start and then Rich, please jump in. But we would really hope that there would be online communication about sources of support, the importance of talking to others, permission for a range of emotions. Have you talked to your parents? Just trying to take Rich's phrase, increase the circle of care. And how can we do that with our online environment? Can we have a chat where everybody has a chance to talk about how they're experiencing the loss and what can we all do together to support each other?
And I find that online learning can bring together, large groups of kids or staff in a very positive way. And I think this is a very social media, and the internet is right on the cusp of crisis intervention in the schools, as schools struggle on how to cope with social media. When crises occur in the old days, that you might find out at some time during the morning, but now all the news arrives to everybody simultaneously over the internet. Yet it can be a very powerful tool in safe messaging about difficult topics and about loss. And I think programs like Resilient Together, online learning programs that are really most effective when they're integrated into the school's plan, so that there is ongoing support for teachers who are kind of experimenting with these roles of reaching out and with their conversational skills. Let me keep you, in mind that Scott and I kind of went through the simulations, and we found we weren't at times, making the correct kinds of observations and statements. So it can be very helpful in learning those kind of critical skills on how to connect, and it's all about connection.
Thank you very much. The next question, I'll target it towards both Rich and Scott, is what do you consider to be a better approach, having a within-school crisis team or have an external team that handles a crisis response? That would include like the Department of Behavioral Health, public school district team, etc.
Go ahead, Scott. we're both eager to answer. Go ahead.
I think it really is helpful when members of the crisis team are known by the students. Now, I know we have very small and very rural schools, and that's challenging because, a rural school might not have a school psychologist, likely would not. The counselor might have to come and only be there part-time. But when kids have trusted adults around them that they know, I think things go better. But having been in a position many times where these kids have never seen me before in their life, but now something tragic happened, that's why I think it's really important that I sit down. I not start talking about all of the crises I've responded to. I should say nothing that takes it away from what they are experiencing. I need to make sure I absolutely have the facts. And I'm reminded of a time when the teacher is sobbing next to me. So I had to start the session. But when the teacher recovered and started talking, I grew silent because we really want to, as much as possible, have the people that kids know have a central part in charting the course for recovery and providing opportunities to express emotions.
And I would certainly resonate what Scott said. Familiar faces reassure safety and security. At times when district crisis teams would come to my school, I would have them do our duty so we could be there for the students directly. A student will stand in line 2 hours to talk to their counselor versus talking to an unfamiliar face that is there for the day. If you do not have a plan in place, the private sector, the community, will descend upon the school to help. And at a time, under pressure to determine who is appropriate to come onto our campus, most of this has to be done in prevention and planning.
Great point. And I would only add that the elementary counselors come to the middle school because the kids knew them from their elementary school. And the middle school staff go help the affected high school because they're known to the students.
I would only just add one more thing, please, Maria. When talking to kids, at times, some administrators may feel, I want every kid in my school to get the same message, so I'm going to put every kid in the auditorium and we're going to talk about some difficult topics. Scott and I would recommend against this, that certain topics such as suicide should only be done in small groups of a classroom size and never done in assemblies.
Thank you very much to both of you for answering that question. I'm going to ask one last question. I know that we are at the hour, but this question has come up a lot in terms of time. The question is, you said postvention often does not last long enough after a tragedy. What is an appropriate amount of time to have extra support and help present after a loss? And that will be our last question during this session.
Well, I would say you need to carry the support, for as long as indicated on the school site, depending upon the crisis. But planning in the aftermath of a loss, such as a loss by suicide or a loss by accident or homicide, usually planning for the entire year, because in the recovery phase or long-term phase, there are going to be events at the end of the year, such as graduation, prom, birthdays, anniversaries, that are going to evoke responses from kids. So it's always good to have a plan that runs at least a year.
I'd like to add just one thing as we start towards the end of the school year. Rich and I get calls in mid-May, late May that are sort of like, thank goodness school is out. We've had all these tragedies. I can't wait for the students to go home for the summer. And I think you can probably figure out how we would respond, which is, how long are the counseling staff working into June? When do they come back? Who could make phone calls to kids that we know are really affected on June 30th or on July 15th? So we can try to find out if they're getting enough support from parents and the community. And I have one thought that I shared with Parkland parents, and here it is. When a kid lives in a stable family, when they are shown unconditional love, I believe they can overcome almost anything. And having trusted, supportive adults in kids' lives is critical to overcoming trauma.
Thank you so much. I want to say that we've received an overwhelming amount of questions that we were unable to answer during the presentation. So what we'll do is we're going to collect all of the questions, connect with the panelists offline, and provide answers, and then reshare a document with all of the attendees so you have all of this great content available to you, including the recording and the slides. With that, I want to thank our presenters for an amazing presentation, as well as for contributing to producing this great simulation that is now available for all school districts to help with their crisis response plan after a loss. And of course, to all of our attendees who joined us today, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.